the father of standard time, Charles Ferdinand Dowd.
We probably never heard of him. Kate.
Right. The idea about standard time is having time zones, but they're synchronized on the hour. That was not an issue in life until there were trains. Trains that were, everyone ran by local time up until the 1800s, and watches weren't really that great. So, that's why they often had horns that went off at noon, because that was the one time in the day, and people often would set their watches.
By the whistle.
By the whistle, the horn, the whatever. The ball dropping, as in Greenwich, England. But when trains came, there had to be schedules, especially on lines where there was just one set of tracks, and sometimes the trains were going this way, and sometimes the trains were going that way, and they needed to know that they pulled over on the siding. It's important with trains. And what each of the 800 train companies in the United States in the 1800s decided to do independently was to pick the largest city on their route, and that was the time they would use on their schedule. So that meant in Albany's train station, there were 4 clocks. One for Albany time, the local time, one for New York City time, which wasn't that different. But the Boston clock and the Buffalo clock were quite different from each other.
Well, you would expect it of Boston and Buffalo, right?
The sun traveling, right. And Charles Ferdinand Dowd, who was the head of the Temple Grove Ladies Seminary in Saratoga Springs, and it's located on the northeast corner of Congress Park, what is now the Skidmore Apartments.
Wow.
That was the building that the Temple Grove Ladies Seminary was in. And he had nothing to do with trains. He was a Presbyterian minister, but he thought it was not right. And he decided to solve the problem. And he very quickly came up with the idea of having time zones. And then he had to convince the train companies of it. And he lobbied for over 10 years. But he finally convinced them, and on a day in November of 1883 was the day with two noons, because that was the day that the train companies were going to synchronize at noon. That they were sending telegraphs off to all the stations in first the Eastern time zone that this is noon. Start your clocks, or push them forward, push them back, whatever you have to do.
Synchronize your watches.
Synchronize your watches. And I thought when I was researching this, if the Saratogian existed then, and I bet it did, and it did, I would have sent out a reporter to interview Charles Ferdinand Dowd on the day of two noons. So I looked up in their newspaper, their microfiche, that day and the day after, and there was an interview with him. And it was a beautiful interview, just what I needed, because it was just question and answer. It wasn't any, it was just what I wanted. And the last question was, did you receive any pecuniary satisfaction for your work? Pecuniary, you don't...
I was going to say it's a new word for this age, yeah.
Yeah, money. Did you get any money for this? And his answer was, no, other than selling my booklets, which described my idea. I didn't receive any money for this. But for me, it was a labor con amore, and that wasn't translated into a labor of love, just a labor con amore, and I am pleased that the solution to this problem has been implemented in my own time.
Wow.